morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time of day it is. Thank you for tuning in to Conversations with Dr. Don. For your first-time viewers, Conversations with Dr. Don is an ongoing series of one-hour talk shows where I interview interesting people like most of you out there about who they are as unique, one-of-a-kind individuals and about whatever it is that we have decided to talk about. And tonight we'll be talking about alternatives to the death penalty. And there's a Roman numeral 2 after that title because some time ago, not too long ago, we had the first show that Ron Steiner was here along with a cohort of his. And it was so good and we decided to do a follow-up and see where things stand today in this issue and what's going on. Ron Steiner.
Hi, Dr. Don. Nice to be with you again.
You betcha. And first time, Jeff. Thank
Ellis.
you.
Yes.
Ellis. Jeff Ellis, yeah. How are you feeling right now?
Feeling good.
And you?
I'm on top of the world.
Disgusting. I'm the only one nervous around here, you know. Yeah, we're going to have a good show because what you're talking about is dear to my heart, and you're very interesting and fun to talk about most anything in the world. And as I said earlier on, if we run out of stuff to talk about, I'll create something out of the ether that we'll just visit about. All right. So, shall we take Jeff first?
Sure.
The first victim. You ready?
I'm ready.
All right.
Ask away.
Ask away. If I ask your best friend who is Jeff, what would he or she say? Jeff is what? Be your best friend. Yeah.
Oh boy. I'm not sure that I want to repeat what my best friend might say about me, but I think he would or she would probably say that I'm a husband, I'm a father, but that I'm also an attorney and that I represent people around this country who are condemned to die in our prisons.
Say that again.
I represent people who have been sentenced to death, who have been condemned to die, and it's my job to try to stop that from happening.
Oh wow, that's really important. You betcha. Yeah. So, and when and where were you born?
I was born in Everett, Washington, back in 1961.
Oh, sure. You're a Northwest person, huh?
I am Northwest native.
Yeah. Why were you born?
Why was I born?
Why does everybody repeat that question back to me? I can't figure that out.
Well, I think I was born to do this.
Do what? What is it you're doing?
Is to defend individuals in our criminal justice system, but more so to try to create a community that we all want to live in.
You betcha. All right. Anything significant about your racial or national or cultural heritage that the viewers would be curious about? Are you from Mars or something like that?
I'm not from Mars, no. You know, I grew up in Everett, so the suburbs, a largely white population. It probably comes as no surprise to you or your viewers that working in the criminal justice system, I see disproportionately people of color, because that's what our criminal justice system unfortunately does, is incarcerate and sentence to death people of color disproportionately.
Criminal justice, that doesn't apply to what you're talking about. Is there any criminal justice system now? Is it really
Well,
justice?
that's the charitable name that we give it.
Do you have a religious preference? Some people say yes, some people say no, some people say I don't want to answer. Do you have one or not?
I don't have any religious preference.
Did you ever have one?
I did. I was born and raised in the Lutheran Church.
Lutheran Church, okay. And and your formal education, Jeff?
My formal education, well, I went to undergraduate at Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma, and then I went to law school at the University of Oregon in Eugene.
Any other formal education comes to mind? You take any special courses or?
Well, lawyers always have to take continuing legal education, so I take multiple courses every year. Over the last decade or so, most of those courses have focused on the administration of the death penalty in the United States.
Okay. Yeah, and you're still working. You're not retired yet like Ron and I are.
No, I'm still working. I'd like to be unemployed. I'd like the death penalty to go away, and I could look for some different work.
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
you can help us with that, Dr. Don.
Yeah. Do you have a partner, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, or anything like that?
Yeah, I have a partner. I have a wife and 2 children, 2 daughters.
How old are they?
My daughters, my youngest is 16. She's a student here in Portland at St. Mary's High School, and my oldest is 24, and she currently lives in Berlin, Germany.
In Germany?
Mhm.
How come she's over there?
You'd probably have to ask her to get the true answer. She learned to speak German. She graduated from college. She recognized that there weren't a whole lot of jobs out there and decided to go work over in Germany.
How long has she been over there?
About 2 years now.
And she likes it.
She does.
Mm-hmm. Do you speak German?
I don't.
Your political persuasion on the continuum, are you more left than right, or more right than left, or would you see yourself on that continuum?
Yeah, I'm more left. But again, my interest really revolves around my work, which is on matters of the criminal system and how we treat individuals who are accused of crime and how we see the community. So that's really been my focus, both in my work life and also in my politics.
How'd you choose that as an interest?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
I think it's that whole idea of how do we treat the least among us is really a motivating factor for me. I'd like to think that I have some ability and opportunity to bring something out of a tragic situation. So if I can tell you a quick story, one of my proudest moments
Please.
Involves asking the parents of a 7-year-old girl who was murdered, asking them what I could do for her. And the mother told me, the thing that you can do for me is you can have your client confess to the crime, and then we can put an end to this case. It had been a death penalty case that had been going on for more than 20 years. That's what she really wanted. She didn't want the death penalty. The death penalty wasn't going to bring her daughter back. And what she wanted to hear the person who killed her daughter say, I did it and I'm sorry. And so I was able to convince him that that was the right thing to do. And then he did that in open court. And afterwards, she introduced me to her surviving daughter and said, this is Jeff Ellis. He helped us. He helped us get the answers that we always wanted. And then we were able to return the locket from their deceased daughter to them. And they began crying. And I felt like it was a terrible, terrible situation, tragic situation. But we tried to bring some good to that, some small amount of healing. Sometimes the criminal justice system doesn't do that. I think as human beings we can do that. And I really feel privileged to be part of that and to be able to share that story.
I imagine you're able to put things away when you go home at night, when you leave the office, because what you're talking about is the most ultimate seriousness.
Well, not always.
Yeah.
I still carry around the ghosts of the clients that I've represented who've been executed, who've been killed by the state of Texas in several instances, killed by the state of Washington in one instance. The prospect of further executions is a very difficult thing, and because my job is to try to stop that from happening. That's the burden that I carry. But I do my best to put it aside, and I'm always lifted up by the people that I get to meet, and those include my clients, they include victims, they include people who also want to bring some good out of what are terrible and tragic situations.
Okay. Memberships in political, social, or civic organizations, any come to mind for you?
I'm a member of many professional organizations, so criminal defense organizations,
Yes.
the American Bar Association. But I'm also a member of groups like, there's a group that I joined in Washington State called Friends and Families of Victims of Violent Crime. And those are people who've had loved ones who have been murdered. So I consider myself a friend of those. I think one of our duties is to support people who've been afflicted by violent crime.
That's good. You have the ability to put it away at least sometimes when you leave home and leave the office and go home. I can imagine what that must be like dealing with that all on an ongoing basis. There's something very special about you. My hat's off to you.
Thank you.
Persons from the past or alive today that you particularly admire or look up to. Any names come to mind? Like Ron, for example?
Well, Ron, of course, absolutely. Absolutely. The person who comes to mind is a young man named Napoleon Beasley. Napoleon Beasley was one of the last juveniles to be executed in the United States. He committed a crime when he was 17 years old. He was executed in 2001, and only a couple years later we made it unconstitutional to execute juveniles. Mr. Beasley, before he died, the last statement that he made was a call for healing. He said, I'm not going to be able to bring that about in my lifetime, but there are men who have done misguided and terrible things, and we need to give them an opportunity to try to make it right. And so here's a guy who's going to his death, who's being put to death by the state of Texas. And in his last statement, he talks about healing and opportunities for restorative justice to try to bring some good about. I think that's a remarkable thing, to be such a young man, but to have such insight and to care not so much about his own personal situation, but a broader legacy. And so I admire that he was willing to do that.
Did you have any special training to become a counselor or a shrink of some sort? Because it sounds like there's a lot of what you're doing in dealing with victims and victims' families.
I have many good mentors around me who've taught me, and one of the things I try to do is learn something new every day, and not think that I necessarily know it all. So I'm always open to other people and other ideas. Hopefully they teach me something.
Okay. All right, shall we switch over and take on Ron?
Sure.
And it's been a long time since you've been on, so if you have the answers that you had before, it doesn't matter. Because
I probably would not change my answers. So.
You got a lawyer here, be careful. Yeah. So, and where were you born?
I was born in Indiana, Pennsylvania, in western Pennsylvania, about 60 miles from Pittsburgh.
Uh-huh. And when was that?
1939.
39. Boy.
So I'm 77. He'd save you doing the math.
I can't do it that high anyhow. Why were you born, Ron?
I guess my parents were very much in love and wanted to have a family, and brought me up in this little town, which was an interesting way to grow up. My dad was a butcher. I'm a son of a butcher.
What's your language?
Yeah. and my mother was a school teacher before they got married, and then they had 3 kids in a row, and then she became a homemaker, housewife, if you will.
Mm-hmm. How did you get involved in this kind of work?
Well, it's sort of a circuitous route. I had a career in the television industry. I was a salesman, and that's my basic talent, I think, selling. And I worked very successfully in that industry for a long time. And then as I had a consultancy the last 30 years of that business, and started to try and slow down to do other things, to get involved with community service. And my children, actually, they were high school kids at the time, and they started to get into community service and do things. And I saw some miraculous things happening with them and their friends. Right. And I said, well, I haven't done any of that. I've been chasing the dollar all this time, thinking my job was to provide, and I need to do some of that. So I started to volunteer with some organizations, and one of them was called the Dismas House. And the Dismas House was a halfway house for formerly incarcerated men and women to try and give them support to re-enter into society. And my job, I like to cook, and our job was to get down there once a month, cook a meal, have dinner with these folks. And my image was that these are all bad guys, and they're different than me. Well, immediately I saw that they weren't bad guys. They were very much like me, but they maybe didn't have the right kind of background, or they made some mistakes along the way, but they got in trouble, and many of them were trying to redeem themselves. But the system works against people who have come out of prison. There's homelessness. There's people who don't have the background to get a job. They don't have the kind of family support in many cases. And this organization, the Dismas House, did such great work to get people on. This was in New Mexico, and the recidivism rate in New Mexico was somewhere in the 70s, people who reoffended and went back to prison. If you went through the program for 9 months with the Dismas House, the recidivism rate was 7%. only because they had the kind of support that allowed them to re-enter and do the right things from then on. So that got me into that, and then some people who were involved in the abolition of the death penalty effort in New Mexico were aware of what we were doing at the Dismas House, and because of my marketing background, they invited me to join the New Mexico Coalition to abolish the death penalty. Mm-hmm. And I worked with them for about 8 years, and we finally did abolish the death penalty in 2009. So I feel really good about that. That's something that I was very proud of, and we were involved in all the process to get that done, and it was very heartening, and I met some absolutely wonderful people, like Jeff is talking about, some of the crusaders in this movement, some very wonderful people who were involved in it, and that's been a blessing for me.
Your work is cut out for you. Are we going to eventually abolish the death penalty in America?
I think so, very much so. It's just a matter of time, and there are several ways that have that happen. Mm-hmm. On a state-by-state basis, it can happen, and it's moving in that direction. Or the Supreme Court at some point in time, like they made it unconstitutional to execute juveniles, and then they made it unconstitutional to execute people with mental disabilities. At some point, they're going to say, we just shouldn't be killing our citizens.
Well, there are some people who will be unhappy with you having that point of view.
That's okay. The country's made up of a lot of people with a lot of different views. Yeah. And I think there's good reason for people to question what we do as we question what they do. And what we're finding here in Oregon is the fact that a lot of people, most everybody has an opinion on the death penalty, mm-hmm. but their depth of knowledge of what all is involved is quite shallow in many cases. And that's not their fault necessarily, they just haven't been exposed to all of the things that are involved. And if they listen to other points of view and we listen to them and their points of view, that's how we make progress. To take a position and stick with it and not listen to anybody doesn't help anybody.
Okay, all right. Anything significant about your national or cultural heritage that's worth mentioning or not?
I'm a mixture. My dad was a Hungarian Jew. My mother was an Italian Catholic.
Whoa, what a mixture.
So it was a great tradition. I love both families a lot, and they all contributed to who I am. I had a whole bunch of uncles and aunts.
Yeah. You're a gentle man. It's apparent in your eyes, yeah. Your formal education.
I went to college in Western Pennsylvania, a small college, Allegheny College. Was more concentrated in drinking beer and chasing girls and playing football than I was in studies, so I wasn't a great student there. And then I got the idea that I should go to law school and to be somebody like Jeff, and I went for 1 year working in the daytime, going to school at night, and I flunked out. So I went back to selling, and that became my career, selling and then training salespeople and managers.
Are you still selling?
I sell every day when we're talking about the death penalty. Absolutely.
Yeah. Your partner, you mentioned children. You have a boyfriend, a girlfriend?
I have a wife. We have a blended family. Uh-huh. We have 6 children between us and 12 grandchildren. Some of them are close by and some of them are quite distant, but we enjoy our family.
Mm-hmm. How about the youngest ones?
The youngest grandchildren are 8 now, and the oldest ones are in their 20s.
Do they like you?
Most of them do.
His honesty is something. How about your politics? So you're left or right, or what?
I'm probably leaning left, but fiscally I'd probably be more on the conservative side. I despise the waste that goes on in the way we spend our taxpayers' monies at times. And having a death penalty is one of those examples. It's a total waste of money, and a lot of money.
Yeah. Memberships in political, social, or civic organizations, any come to mind? ODEP, what is that?
You know, I've tried to be in different organizations in my lifetime, mm-hmm. but the regimen of going to a weekly meeting always was difficult for me because I was traveling too much, I was working too much. So I wasn't a great joiner in that respect. I am involved and have been involved with another organization similar to what Jeff was, called Murder Victim Families for Reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
It's a national organization with members, 4,000, 5,000 members who have lost a loved one but are against the death penalty. I'm not a family member. And again, they brought me in because, as a board member, because they respected the fact that I had some acumen in marketing, but I was served on their board for 6 years, and I'm still involved with them. Mm-hmm. And that's a wonderful organization, and they are very, very powerful voices when faced with the question, and someone says, well, what if it happened to your daughter? Mm-hmm. Talking about a murder.
Yeah.
And they can come back and say, it did happen to my daughter, and here are a litany of reasons that I'm against the death penalty. Doesn't bring her back, doesn't make us forget her, doesn't tarnish her memory. It wastes money, and we get ignored in the criminal justice system when the prosecutors are trying to get a conviction of death.
What about vengeance is mine?
Vengeance is mine is a very big cause of problems. Vengeance of any kind causes problems.
Yeah. Okay. Persons from the past or alive today that you look up to or admire. Any names?
Jeff, for starters. No, I've met a lot of great people. Since I am a little senior in this movement and have been doing it for 16 years now, I hearken back to some of the people who were in this process as older people when I was younger. One of them, his name was Art Riffenberg in New Mexico. He was on our advisory council, we served together on that. And he was probably already into his early 80s, a former state police officer and federal parole officer, very much against the death penalty. With that background, that's sort of unusual.
Yes.
He was ill. He had lung disease. He came to our meetings, struggled to our meetings with an oxygen tank on his back just to get there, and his devotion to all of this was admirable. So at one time in our 5th or 6th year, I was getting a little frustrated it was taking so long, and Art says to me, Ron, you got to be patient. Working on the death penalty is a little bit like farming redwoods. And he was right.
I know. I'm going to save that one. Well, we're on a roll now, so let's stop this part because time has flown by quicker than I thought, so we can come back and get to the main topic of what this show is about. So, can we take a break, Mr. Director? Okay, looks like we are back. Thanks for staying tuned. And for you viewers who missed the opening of the show, you're watching Conversations with Dr. Don. It's an ongoing series of 1-hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people like my guests here tonight about who they are. And we've done that in the first half of the show. And we're going to talk about alternatives to the death penalty, Roman numeral 2, because the first show was Ron and an associate of his, and we revisiting it now because there's newer information now available. So let's continue on, all right? So you want to start talking about that first before I ask you any questions?
The new information?
Yeah.
Well, what might be notable for people to understand is the death penalty is losing favor across the country. Mm-hmm. Fewer states are giving out death sentences. Fewer states are executing people. Last year, 2015, only 6 states executed anybody. They were all in the South. former slave states, the Bible Belt states. This year, there are probably going to be less executions. There's certainly less death sentences issued. So when the Constitution talks about in the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual, the fewer and fewer people who use the death penalty makes it unusual. And hopefully the Supreme Court's going to say, well, if only 3 or 4 states around the South, particularly Texas, this year Georgia, are doing it, why should the rest of the country have to deal with it? So hopefully that's going to be. So the big news is the tide is moving very much in the direction of let's move on and find some alternatives that are smart on crime instead of this advocacy for tough on crime using the death penalty as the example.
You see in the future where there'll be something on the national level, a constitutional amendment or something of that nature, where death penalty is illegal?
Well, the Supreme Court can do that by adjudicating as such. Jeff is as an expert on the Supreme Court and their dealings.
Well, the Supreme Court back in 1972 declared the death penalty unconstitutional because it had been administered in an arbitrary fashion. The famous quote from the case is called Furman versus Georgia, and the famous quote is that the death penalty was as arbitrary as being struck by lightning. And so the court struck down the death penalty in 1972, but a lot of states still wanted to use the death penalty, so they quickly ran back to their legislatures, passed new death penalty laws, and then in 1976, in another U.S. Supreme Court case, this one called Gregg versus Georgia, the court said it was okay to continue with the death penalty. But we're getting back to a period of time where the Supreme Court is being asked to consider whether the death penalty remains constitutional or should be declared unconstitutional again, for the reasons that Ron pointed out, because we see declining numbers of executions, we see declining number of death sentences, and in fact, most of our death sentences come from a very, very small percentage of this country's population. 2% of the counties, 2% produce 60% of our death sentences. So the death penalty, even in a place like Texas, which we think of as a state that produces a large number of death sentences, even in Texas, most of those death sentences come out of a very small number of counties. You can go to Travis County, Texas, which is Austin, Texas, and they produced almost no death sentences there.
And that has to do with what's going on locally then?
It has everything to do with what's going on locally.
Oh, your work is still cut out for you. So I have some questions here that you submitted to me to prompt our conversation. Unless you want to volunteer some more stuff that you want to talk about, I would address these questions.
Go with the
right?
questions now.
Has the U.S. always had the death penalty, and what about Oregon?
Well, it depends where you look. When we formed the country, the death penalty was in place, and we noted in our Constitution that the death penalty existed. But we are a nation of states, and a number of states have never had the death penalty. The state of Michigan, their very first act when they created their state was to abolish the death penalty, and Michigan's never had the death penalty. And there's a number of states that have never had the death penalty, just as there are other states that have. Oregon has had a very on-again, off-again relationship with the death penalty. We had the death penalty when we were formed as a state. We abolished it in 1914. Governor Oswald West, the governor at the time, thought if we put this in our Constitution, we'll get rid of the death penalty once and for all. It was a popular vote of the people, and the people adopted a constitutional amendment that said from this day forward, there shall not be a death penalty in Oregon. Well, we changed our mind in 1920 and we put it back in, and then we abolished it again in 1964. A number of folks here in Oregon worked really hard to abolish the death penalty, and they were successful. But then we changed our mind again. And after the U.S. Supreme Court in 1976 said that we could have the death penalty again, we added it back in 1981. It was struck down as unconstitutional in 1981. We put it back in 1984. It's been struck down, at least portions, as unconstitutional since. So we've had kind of a schizophrenic relationship in Oregon with the death penalty.
Yeah. So it's great work you're doing. All right. What are the major developments in the death penalty in the U.S. over the last 20 years, what about in Oregon? Major developments, and you touched on that a bit, I think, huh? What's happening in
Well,
Oregon?
we've talked a little bit about it. I mean, I think the most important thing in Oregon right now is to know that there's what's called a moratorium on executions, which means that the governor has said that no executions should take place until we have another popular vote on the death penalty. That happened back in 2011 when Governor Kitzhaber was our governor. He was faced with the prospect of an execution. He had previously presided over the 2 executions that had happened in the modern death penalty here in Oregon, and he was very, very troubled with not having stopped those executions. And so in 2011 he said, I'm declaring a moratorium, shall not be an execution. When he resigned and Governor Brown became governor, she continued the moratorium. So we don't have executions in Oregon. We still have death penalty cases moving forward. We're still paying the bill for the death penalty in Oregon, but at this point we're not executing people. And eventually, I presume, we will have a popular vote where we'll ask Oregonians again, do you want to keep the death penalty or do you want to get rid of the death penalty? And you want to consider alternatives to the death penalty.
What about the cases where they found out, like the Justice Project, that the people who were sentenced to death were sentenced erroneously? Somehow they shouldn't have been subject to the death penalty.
Well, since 1976, as Jeff said, when the Supreme Court allowed it to come back, there's been 156 cases of people who were tried and convicted of murder, sentenced to death, and later to be found innocent, and have been released, exonerated from their acts. There are lots of other cases in Oregon. Jeff knows the statistics on this. Oregon has a lot of cases that have been overturned and sent back to lower courts for review. So mistakes are made, and we're humans, and we're glad that mistakes are found out, but mistakes are made in this process. But when it is so deadly to order an execution, we need to be awfully careful. And the alternatives would be to get rid of the death penalty, put them in prison for life if that's required, and move forward in a more constructive way.
Wow. What's going to happen to the death penalty in Oregon over the next decade? What's going to happen? And how will that happen?
Well, Jeff already talked about part of it. It requires a vote of the people. And our job as Oregonians for alternatives to the death penalty, Jeff is on our board, and he serves as the expert in the technical aspects, the legal aspects of it. Several of the rest of us are involved in grassroots organizing to help educate people about the death penalty. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of people have an opinion about the death penalty, but they don't know a lot about it and the issues that surround it. I can't tell you how many people, when I've provoked the conversation, said, do we have a death penalty in Oregon? They don't even know that much. And I've had legislators say stuff that's almost that bad. They just don't think about it. So we have to get it on the ballot in some form, either a legislative referral or a signature campaign to get it on, and then the people get to vote. And we hope that we have done a good job in terms of education, that people will say, the death penalty does not make sense. It's wasteful in terms of our taxpayers' money, and there are alternatives that work just as well to keep us safe and mete out justice.
So you mentioned earlier about, was it New Mexico, where with the proper education, the recidivism rate went way down to about 7% compared to 70% before. So you know what you're doing in those instances where you have this kind of a dramatic effect?
Well, the corresponding activity that's going on in Oregon right now, and we have to give the legislature credit for this, they passed something called the Criminal Justice Reinvestment Act, where they gave each of the counties a certain amount of money. Original bill was $11 million. The second biennium, they goosed that up to $27 million. So each county gets to form a cooperative effort with all of the stakeholders. the judges, the prosecutors, the defense attorneys, the sheriffs, the police chiefs, the social service agencies, the health and human service folks, and they meet together and say, okay, we've got some problems here. Our jails, our prisons are overflowing with people. It's costing enormous amounts of money. Our recidivism rate is wrong. What do we do with that? And most of the efforts that are being successful are involved in re-entry, where they are very informed about being smart on to crime and doing things that reduce the number of people who go back to prison, hence reducing the prison population and the jail population. Multnomah County is a perfect example. They have reduced their jail and prison population by 30% over the last 4 years. That's a lot of savings, and people are now under probation and parole and getting the services that help them from reoffending.
And how that happened? Because of the kind of programs you mentioned earlier?
Exactly. People are cooperating. It used to be that prosecutors and defense attorneys wouldn't talk to each other, and now they're talking to each other. The judges and the attorneys are talking. The police chiefs and the sheriffs are talking. Everybody's talking now, and that's what is solving the problems.
A few years ago, there was a survey of police chiefs, and the question that was asked of them is, what resources do you need to help keep our communities safer? The death penalty came in dead last. That was the last thing on a list of things to keep our communities safer, because the police chiefs realize the death penalty doesn't keep us safe.
No.
So at the top of the list were things like educational and work opportunities, mental health treatment, drug and alcohol treatment, essentially opportunities to prevent crime before it happens. And I think we can all agree that we're much better off as a community before stopping something happen rather than simply looking at and spending all the money to punish after it happens. So I think Ron and I are both interested in prevention rather than punishment. Punishment has to happen when somebody commits a crime, but we're a better community if we prevent crime.
Yeah, I bet you've got some interesting stories and your career and what you've been doing and this fighting the death penalty and alternatives. Have any thoughts come to mind about interesting stories?
Well, again, a lot of the stories that come to mind are stories about the needs of victims. I think sometimes we think that we have the death penalty serve the needs of victims, but when you talk to many victims of violent crimes, it's not the death penalty that they want. And the criminal justice system rarely asks what are their needs. Just 2 weeks ago, I went to a prison with a man who was 12 years old at the time that my client killed his mother.
Mm-hmm.
So he's lived now 27 years since the death of his mother, and this was the first time he met with the person who killed his mother. He wanted to do that. The prison tried to prevent that from happening. They did not want it to happen. But he had questions that he'd struggled with for more than 20 years since the death of his mother that he wanted answered. At that meeting, my client apologized, said that he was sorry. He asked this young man what he could do to help him. And it was a very moving and emotional conversation. That's what the criminal justice system should aspire to, asking what are the needs of victims. Unfortunately, it's what the criminal justice system oftentimes prevents. So he now wants to work on opportunities for victim-offender reconciliation. He believes that that's a good thing. If that individual, the person who killed his mother, had been subject to the death penalty, that meeting could have never happened because the person would have been killed. And the death penalty says that we don't want to try to do that. And I hear victims all the time say, that's a good, that's something I want, that's something I want the criminal justice system to make happen. And the death penalty says there will be no opportunities for that.
Is it possible that these people you're talking about who've committed a capital crime have the attention and some serious caring with people like yourself that would affect them and have a better outcome in their life thereafter? once they're not being put to death.
I've got a story, a very recent story, just happened 2 weeks ago. OADP has a correspondence organization that makes sure that everybody on the row has somebody that's writing to them, that's paying attention to them, because many of these people get deserted by their families. And a woman who was on the correspondence committee for a long, long time, wrote for years and years and years to this gentleman that's on death row, and was a big inspiration. She passed away. And the prisoner wrote a letter to the daughter of this woman saying how much she had helped him and changed his life from the deprived, disciplined life that he was living before to one where he was more interested in helping other people, like Anne helped him. It's a very moving letter written by somebody who probably doesn't have more than an 8th grade education, but he has transformed into somebody who really cares about making the best of the terrible life that he has to live.
So if somehow or other we manage to get through to human beings to engage that empathy, sympathy,
Absolutely.
Those characteristics, and to pay attention to somebody and really be interested in what they're about, that's enough oftentimes to have a person be available for something other than what they've been going through before they committed the capital crime.
Don, I think we're all more than our worst act. Our worst act should not be our sole definition. So if you do a shoplift, it doesn't mean you're a shoplifter. It means that you've done something, and that you probably owe something back to the community for having done that. But that hopefully you have the ability to pay back for your crime, and that you shouldn't be defined that way. So someone who commits a murder is a murderer, but they're more than simply a murderer. And I share Ron's feeling that all of us have the ability to have empathy and compassion. And when a murder happens, it creates a relationship between the murderer and the friends and families of that victim. And that creates a series of needs. I think what we're saying is we've answered that with, well, we'll just put that person to death. It'll take us 20 or 30 years. And actually the reality is the most likely thing is that at some point it will become a life sentence. And so we're really tricking you when we tell you that we're going to put them to death. That's not a working solution. The death penalty in Oregon has never worked. We've not had, since we reinstated the death penalty, a single execution against somebody's will, where the system has worked and come to its conclusion. We've said that person is the worst of the worst. We as a society deserve to put that person to death. So we have a system, a government system that hasn't worked for nearly 40 years. And it's not about to begin working. And more importantly than that, it is not serving the needs of the victims. And that's what we have to do, is we have to ask as a community how we best serve our needs. And if we start asking that question, I agree with Ron that the more you know about the death penalty, the less likely you are to support it.
It sounds like really interesting and worthwhile work what you're doing, that you're about. You got any more stories for us, Ron?
Pardon?
You got any more stories for us?
No, I could probably think of them, but the conversation is precisely what we're trying to do. Just get people to open up their minds and talk a little bit about it and listen to a little bit about it and see how it relates to them. One of the things, when I was a salesperson, I learned early on the stereotypical image of a salesperson is all bad. They do all the talking. I learned how to not only do it, but teach it how to sell by listening. And that's the same thing with this. You listen to the other people's needs. When they tell you what their needs are, then if you're in a position to fulfill those needs, you can do that. If you're selling toothpaste, as I did at one time, or television advertising, as I did at one time, then they tell you what they need, and then you fulfill those needs. If you can't fulfill the needs, why keep trying to talk them into something that they don't need? So it's the same thing with the death penalty. If somebody is absolutely dead set on favoring the death penalty and they're not going to change their mind, I don't spend a lot of time talking to them. But it's a person that says, I support the death penalty, but I have some questions.
Then you got a possibility.
Yeah, then you have something to talk about, and then you say, okay, what are your concerns? What are the things you're questioning? What are the issues that maybe come up for you that might be different than your core reaction to this?
What about the basic idea about a human being having the right to take the life of a fellow human being? Whether it's by judicial action or individually, or is there any time that it's okay to kill another human being?
I don't think so. And the death penalty is disguised. It says the state is responsible for doing that. Well, we are the state. The people are the state. So as Sister Helen Prejean likes to say, every time you have an execution, everybody in that state has their hand on the gurney.
Wow, you're full of those kinds of things. Yeah. Yeah.
The death penalty makes killers of us all. It brutalizes us all. It says that killing is an answer to killing. You know, we don't rape the rapist. We don't steal from the robber. So why, when we get to the most serious crime, do we say that the answer is to repeat it?
Oh my gosh, I gotta make some more notes here. It's been really interesting talking to you guys about alternatives to the death penalty. We're running out of time, so let's have you look at the camera and talk to the viewers about any thoughts you have about what we've talked about tonight, or anything else to do with the death penalty that would be useful for the viewers.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Sure. Well, I think one thing that the viewers need to understand is that the death penalty is much, much more expensive than life without parole. Oftentimes we say, well, look, the option is life without parole, but then we're going to have to pay for someone's incarceration for the entirety of their life. But it turns out the death penalty is about 10 to 15 times more expensive than life without parole. What we get in Oregon is the most expensive version of life in prison possible, because we spend all of this money on the death penalty, and the most likely outcome of a case where somebody has been sentenced to death is eventually a life sentence, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. If we got rid of the death penalty, we could save this money, we could spend it on victim services, we could spend it on prevention, we'd be living in a safer community, and I think producing a better quality of justice.
Vengeance, again, it still keeps coming back. Yeah.
There's justice and vengeance are not the same thing. They're very different things. Justice is to do the right thing when you know all of the facts. Vengeance is just to get retribution for something not necessary. So if we still have a minute or so,
yes, of course.
I'd like to say to the viewers that the major thing that we're trying to do is just to open the conversation and get people to think about, to talk about, to learn about the death penalty. Oregon, uniquely, there's only a couple of other states, will need a vote of the people. So we will all, as citizens, voters, get to decide one way or the other whether we have a death penalty or not. That vote is taking place this year, this November, in Oklahoma, in Nebraska, and in California, where the voters are going to get to say up or down on the death penalty. If you're watching this show and you live in one of those states, pay attention to what's going on in your state. If you live in a state where if you live in and know people that are in one of those states, call your friends, call your relatives, say, get on board here. In California, Yes on 62 is their campaign, and everybody in Oregon who moved from California has to have friends and neighbors and relatives down there. So get them involved, get them to learn, let them make an informed decision on how to move on the death penalty in those states.
Wonderful, wonderful message. Yeah, good. So it's about time for us to stop now. So let's have a few public service announcements that our viewers find are useful. To get my show on the web, Google Don Baham YouTube. You can see my shows, hundreds of shows over the years are there on that site. And the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, I'm getting tired. I'm a member for many, many years, and I'll still be a member in the near future. And we got to end corporate personhood. Go to moveToAmend.org to get a constitutional amendment that says corporations are not persons and money is not speech. Yeah. Okay, what else do we want to tell you about here? I got to thank you for watching. Remember KFC, not Kentucky Fried Chicken, Dr. Don's KFC. Kind, friendly, and charitable. Be kind, be friendly, and be charitable to you too, and you too. And you too, like, and YouTube up there. Thanks again for coming, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Dr. Don.
Thank you, Dr. Don.
Certainly good to be with you.
Yeah, pleasure.
I'm Don, and I'm 86 years old. Does anybody else notice the world is going to hell? 2 of my grandkids can't find work. It's hot as hell and getting worse every year. We're cutting down all the trees. We're stripping every living thing from the ocean. So we're making a mess of things. Can't you see? We expect our government to do something about it, and they're not.
The government sucks.
That's right. The phonies we elect to fix things are sitting on their hands and sucking up to big money. Damn, people, I'm scared for my grandkids. What are we leaving for future generations?
I worry about that too.
Hey, I might be old, but I'm not dead. You're not dead. You're still here. And so are you. We've got to get into this thing.
How do we do that?
It starts with government. It's dysfunctional. It is not working, at least not for us.
Never seen it this bad.
Of, by, and for the people. That's how it's supposed to be. Instead, it's corporate fat cats, bankers, and Wall Street. They own the whole show.
But that's not something we can fix.
Wrong, sister, wrong. This is about money. The 1% has damn near all of it. They use their big money to buy our elections. They use it to own our political system. So what if you're old? You're still here. You're still a citizen. We're still here, people. We all need to speak up. We have to be part of the solution. We have a voice. We need to be heard.
Everybody knows things are bad.
So many people are claiming they have the answer. Who do we believe?
You can start by listening to me, please.
You'll be gone soon.
I said before, I'm not dead. I'm here. I'm going to be on this as long as I'm here.
What can we do?
I'm betting on a horse called Move to Amend. Mm-hmm.
I used to be a jockey.
What's Move to Amend?
A coalition of Americans that want a constitutional amendment.
There are all kinds of people talking about amendments.
Only one can deliver. Only one can deliver the change we need.
What change is that?
The amendment has to say corporations are not people.
Corporations are people?
Who made that law?
You know what? No law ever said corporations are people. It was the courts that made it that way.
Courts don't make law.
They created this mess with something called legal precedent.
They just said it was so? So it is?
That's right. You know big tobacco? The cigarette companies are considered people. that gives them and all corporations the right to lie to us and to buy elections using campaign contributions.
They lied a lot.
Corporations are about profit, nothing else.
There has never been a law that says corporations are people. They are state-chartered legal fictions. As such, they should first be accountable to the people, and only then to shareholders and corporate management.
Fat chance that'll ever happen.
What I'm talking about is a big fix. Simple, straightforward, unambiguous, a constitutional amendment. First, it should say corporations are not people, and that's the first part of the big fix. The second part is about money. The amendment must also say money is not speech, it is only property. Just because you have big money doesn't mean you get to use it to buy politicians and public policy. Does everybody get that? Our 28th Amendment. Corporations are not people, and money is not speech.
You want us to say we're for that?
I want you to do it not just for yourself, dear lady. I want you to do it for your kids and your grandkids. My grandkids, that's who I worry about. I'm on this big time for them.
Corporations are not people.
Does everybody get it? We can't fight the dirty money and corruption with something that's lame and half-hearted. We have to join the resistance. Call your kids. Call your friends. Tell them there's a war going on between ordinary citizens like us and the fat cat corporatists. Tell them you've signed up to fight the fat cats, the big money, and the politicians bought and paid for by the fat cats. Tell them you want a constitutional amendment that says
Corporations are not people.
once more.
You know, it'd be so
Jamie Parker says this thing. Jamie Parker.
taking the gift actually trying a different way instead of being all American control.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. We got it.